Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am so excited to talk with Dr. Tim Bono today. He is a happiness expert and a scientist with a focus on positive psychology. So thank you for taking the time to speak with me today, Dr. Bono.
Great to join you today, Dr. Agarwal. Thanks for the invitation.
So we have known each other for more than 10 years. We were both at Washington University in St. Louis for our college degrees in undergrad and our PhDs and full-time research at WashU. So we've known each other for a long time, and I was just hoping to speak with you a bit more about your book, Happiness 101, Simple Secrets to Smart Living and Well-Being. My college students have all read Happiness 101, and it's just so much fun to have you talk to us a little bit more. So I am going to launch right in to the first question I have, which is in Happiness 101, you start off by talking about the distinction between happiness, being happy, and being happier. Can you tell us more about that distinction and why that's important?
Yeah, it's an important one, I think. One of the most common questions I get from folks when they find out that I do research on happiness, they say, well, how can I be happy? Or what do I need to do to become happy? Or how much money do I need to earn to be happy? What kind of major should I pursue in college or career should I end up getting in order to be happy? And as important as that question is, I think that the first thing we need to consider is simply the way that we phrase that question. Because to ask the question, how can I be happy? That seems to suggest that happiness is a binary, that it's an either or. It suggests either I'm going to be happy or I'm going to be unhappy. When in fact, a much more useful approach toward the pursuit of happiness is to acknowledge that happiness itself resides on a continuum. So that instead of treating happiness as if it's a checklist, that once I get the right partner and have the right job and have the right salary and have all the circumstances of my life exactly as I want them, then I can be happy. Much better is to say, well, what are the things I can be doing that will allow me to become happier? What are the behaviors and the mindsets I can be incorporating into my life to move me closer to that happiness end of the continuum? Because the reality is that there will always be things in our lives, external circumstances or things outside of our control that prevent us from being as happy as we wish we could be. But the good news is that there usually are things that are within our control that allow us to become at least happier. And that's what positive psychology is all about. It's about identifying the behaviors, the strategies, the small little things we can be doing every day that we can be incorporating into our lifestyle to at least become happier.
Oh, I love that. And of course, that leads into this idea, as you mentioned, strategies that we can control. Because there's a lot, again, that we can't control in life. So what can we do that we can control to make us happier? So my next question is, in your book, what is one of your favorite strategies? You present research on strategies to help improve our sleep and improve time management and our mental well-being, our physical well-being. My personal favorite is your 6-minute meditation activity. But what is your favorite strategy that you mentioned in your book?
Well, the one that has been most impactful in my own life, and the one that when I am teaching my class in positive psychology, the one I spend the most amount of time on has to do with actually the very last chapter in the book on social connection. Because if we had only one piece of data that we could use to predict the happiness and well-being of an individual, it would be the strength of their social connections. Do they have friends, family, other people in their lives who are that shoulder to lean on when things are not going well, and who are those people who are there to help them celebrate life when things are going well? In fact, when we were putting the book together, when I was working with my editor, there were some debates and discussions over the exact order of the chapters. And I said, it doesn't really matter if sleep goes before exercise or where the meditation chapter goes. But I said, I really want to make sure we end with the chapter on social connection, because that truly is the most important predictor of happiness. And so when we think about how we spend our time and who we spend our time with, it's important to ensure that we are doing what we can to be building strong relationships and capitalizing on those relationships as a way to increase our sense of happiness day in and day out.
So does that mean that in terms of building those relationships, we should, put work projects aside, or how do we it's kind of like a easier said than done, right? There's only so much time in the day. We have so many obligations. So how do we, what is a strategy to help us build those social connections?
Yeah, it's a really important question, Dr. Agarwal, because we all have to make those decisions. Of course, anybody is going to say, yes, relationships are important. But the reality is that on a given day, when we have to make a decision about, well, I have this big project that I'm working on, and if I don't complete this in time, that will reflect poorly on me and perhaps encumber my professional goals. But I also know that I'm supposed to be doing these things, but my friends will be there later if I'm not able to hang out with them on a given day. I think the most important thing when we are evaluating how we're spending our time and the outcomes that are associated with that is to think about it not in terms of on a specific day, what was my decision, but to take a step back and to ask myself, what are the patterns that I've been falling into? Because if it is truly one day where you have to cancel a dinner with a friend so that you can do a work project, if that really only happens once, that's probably not a huge deal. But if you're finding that that is the pattern, every time you set an appointment or a date with to spend time with this family member or friend, you're canceling on them. If there's a pattern that has formed, that's where you want to be a bit more purposeful in following through on subsequent opportunities to spend time with that person. So I think it's all about identifying what those patterns are and ensuring that in general, what are you doing and what are you prioritizing? And then finding out what you can do, which are the work projects that you absolutely have to give attention to, and which are those that maybe you can step away from, because in the grand scheme of things, capitalizing on those friendships is ultimately what's going to be most to your advantage.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Thanks. So looking at the patterns and maybe even thinking about our goals and taking a step back about what is my priority, and are my patterns of behavior matching my priority to build social connections to make me happier?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's all about thinking about where we want to head and the steps that we're taking. Are they realistically getting us there? It's one thing to have a lofty ideal. It's something different to really be taking a look at our day-to-day patterns of behavior and the mindsets that we are adopting and asking ourselves, is that leading us in the direction of where we want to go? Or is that otherwise just some lofty ideal that we're not actually putting ourselves on a path toward achieving?
Great. Well, and so your book has been published for a little bit of time now. What is something you would love to add to your book now that it's been published? Is there a new strategy, new research? What's something that's missing that you would love to add if you could?
I think that, a lot of the research that has come out, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic, and the pandemic, of course, that we're still in, has been the ways that people interact with one another on social media. Because I think for a long time, it seemed like the field was saying, well, it's much more important to spend time with people in person than online, which is true, but there's still value in the ways that people connect online. So there's been some research in the ways that you can still be a supportive and empathic friend, even if you are separated by hundreds or thousands of miles. There are still ways that you can develop strong relationships. And so I think that there's an opportunity to delve into some of that research. The ways that even through a text message, yeah, it's best to communicate in person, but if your friend wants to communicate in text, the ways that you ask questions can be done so in a way that is still developing, an authentic connection with that person. And I think the other thing that comes to mind in terms of new ideas that didn't make it into the book that I think is still an important one is simply the idea that, yes, happiness is wonderful, but happiness is not always the most important ideal. There are other things that sometimes it is more valuable to give up sleep or to give up time with other people because there is some other priority that is worthy of your attention in that moment. I mean, I talk to friends of mine who have young children, and for them, one of their important life goals was to have a family. And it would not be appropriate for them to say, I'm going to sleep a full night, and if the kid needs me, I'll just deal with it tomorrow. No, in that moment, being a good parent is more important than your personal happiness. And so you're making sacrifices. And that's, I think, another important piece is that I think that there is something of a cultural obsession with happiness, which kind of interferes with the science we try to conduct on happiness, as if we have decided it's the most important thing. Happiness is a great thing to pursue, but there are circumstances when it's not the most important thing, and that's perfectly appropriate. It's okay to have goals that temporarily put your happiness aside because you're contributing to something for the greater good or for other people and their well-being. becomes more important than your own, and it almost becomes an act of sacrifice, like sacrificial love to yourself for the betterment of another person.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned the science of happiness. So one thing I'm always curious about and skeptical about as a scientist in a different field of psychology is, how is happiness actually measured? Or what's one way that we measure happiness? To me, that just seems so subjective. So how do you actually measure it?
It's a really important question, and it's that question, which is why for a long time we didn't have the science of happiness. We didn't have psychologists giving a serious look at the nature of well-being, because we didn't think that there was a good way to measure it. But it was really in the 90s where we were making really important discoveries, especially in the brain. And there are many people who refer to the 90s as the decade of the brain, where we were uncovering all of these the understanding that we were able to develop about the nuances of the brain, in particular brain regions and brain structures that associated with particular outcomes. And one of those important findings had to do with which regions of the brain were associated with the experience of happiness. In particular, we know that the activation of the left prefrontal cortex plays a really important role in the experience of happiness. And so with that positions scientists to develop scales of measurement that corresponded to that activation of that region of the brain. And those scales have been well validated now, and give us a proxy to show that even when you're looking at more objective measures like brain activity, that corresponds to these other scales that we can more easily administer. And we've even been able to reduce it to something as simple as a single item question: how happy are you on a scale from 1 to 10? And it turns out that single item rating corresponds significantly with even the more sophisticated measures, you might say, that you would get from brain scans.
Yeah.
But part of the reason why we also have confidence in that single item measure is because of a word that you used, actually phrasing the question. It's subjective. It is subjective because it has to be subjective. In fact, when we study happiness, most commonly, we don't even refer to it in academic journals as happiness. We call it subjective well-being, with a really important emphasis on the word subjective, because to know how happy somebody is, you can't always look at how much money they have in the bank, or what their academic background is, or where they live, or whether they're married, or how big their house is. None of that corresponds particularly well with happiness. Instead, it has to do with the subjective appraisal of those circumstances. And so that's another reason why you have to administer a subjective self-report, because it is so much about that subjective appraisal of how things are going. So to answer your question very simply, how do we measure it? We simply ask people on a 10-point scale, how happy are you? And that seems to capture it pretty well, and it corresponds with other objective measures.
That's great. That's really, really helpful to know that scientists are aware that it's a subjective measure and take that into account, as opposed to just giving people surveys and assuming that that's an accurate measure.
Yes, yeah, because it has to be subjective because of the nature of what we're looking at.
Yeah. So my last question is that one thing I love about your book is that it's specifically written for college students. There are lots of happiness books out there, but my students, my own college students, have found that it's really helpful, and many of your examples really resonate with them. What is one takeaway that college students should have from your book? We know that we're only going to remember so much when we read books. So what's kind of the one key highlight or takeaway that you want students to know from Happiness 101?
I hope that one of the key takeaways from this book, especially for college students, is the importance of knowing that we humans have evolved this wonderfully complex set of emotions for a reason. And so people often talk about college as being the best 4 years of your life, and which, it's a great 4 years, but I hope it's not anybody's best 4 years, because that would suggest that the rest of your life is kind of all downhill from there. So when I think the advice I give to my own students, or even to my nephew, who's a senior in high school and he's applying to colleges right now, I say college is going to be a great 4 years, but part of what will make college great will be the ways that you develop the wherewithal to persevere through adversity, and to know how to hold sadness and anxiety and loneliness that inevitably are part of the college experience. And you'll still be able to hold that and experience that distress, but not to the extent to which it encumbers your ability to make progress toward your goals. And so that's one of the takeaways. There's a chapter in there on failing better, and just the psychology of resilience. And I hope that that is something that students understand, kind of going back to the earlier idea that we're not supposed to be happy all the time. A lot of people think that, that if they're not happy all the time, something is wrong with them. But any psychologist would tell you that actually, if you were happy all the time, that would be the indication that something were wrong with you. A really important part of psychological health involves knowing how to keep going even when times are really difficult. And so I hope that that's something that a college student will take away, that if you're feeling, not if, but when you're feeling sadness or distress or loneliness, that's not an indication that you're doing something wrong. It's rather an indication that this is your opportunity to develop those coping skills that are going to serve you well the next time that you experience difficulty in a relationship, in a career, or other aspects of life that are important to you.
Oh, awesome. Fantastic. Well, I absolutely love your book. I know my college students have found it so very helpful in dispelling some of those myths and helping them feel comfortable that it's okay when it's not the best 4 years of your life. That's part of the process. So thank you so much, Dr. Bono, for sharing your research and expertise on the science of happiness with us today.
It's been my pleasure, Dr. Agarwal. Great to connect with you. And it means a lot to know that the students enjoyed the material in the book as well.